panic attack, shortage of breath, increased heart rates. A huge transition is about to occur. What is anxiety, and what's the right kind of anxiety, what's the wrong kind of anxiety, and what level of anxiety do we experience? What's useful to think about is how does anxiety manifest itself in children and young people? What are the telltale signs of a child or teenager who is anxious? And what we found through research is that, well, I'd like to start this presentation with the question of what is anxiety. And anxiety, I suppose, has come to be known as stress or worry. We use different words, but in terms of anxiety, I'd say that it's one of a number of human emotions that we have and can experience. So let's normalize it in that way. A number of psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, philosophers even have tried to define the idea and experience of anxiety. An interesting one was the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who in 1844 spoke about and wrote about this idea of anxiety being the dizziness of freedom. Now, what he meant by that was that anxiety can come from having choices, having possibilities, and making a choice can create a good deal of anxiety. We might think about making the right choice, for example, or the wrong choice, which I think we can all that can all resonate with us today. But I suppose my thinking is that what's the right kind of anxiety, what's the wrong kind of anxiety, and what level of anxiety do we experience? Some anxiety, for example, can enhance our performance, our functioning, but too much of it works in the opposite direction and can really impinge on functioning and productivity. So if we think more now about anxiety in children, which is the key part of the presentation today, then we think that children, if we think about childhood in particular, we think about transitions, and children go through a lot of transitions in their childhood and in their teenage years. So, for example, we might think of the first anxiety-provoking transition would be from being born, and later transitions would be around leaving home, going to nursery, for example, those first days and weeks at nursery, which, as we know, can be very anxiety-provoking for children. Leaving home, leaving parents, it's a real wrench. And so straight away we're identifying one of the key causes of anxiety, which is transitions and changes in life. And later on in childhood years, we can see how certain activities, for example, can create anxiety in children. For example, talking out, presenting something or reading something out in class, for example. Public transport can be difficult for some children in particular, and adults as well. So certain activities can clearly provoke and evoke strong feelings of anxiety. In more serious presentations of anxiety, then we think about panic attacks, for example. Panic attacks really are the sort of human system being overwhelmed, whether with stimuli, with anxious thoughts. So the system really just becomes overwhelmed, and a panic sets in, shortage of breath, and so on and so forth, increased heart rate. So we see here this very close relationship between mind and body, emotions and body, which is a very important aspect, and is something we'll come on to a bit later. The more severe presentations, which are anxiety provoked, if you like, what we might think of as phobias in children in particular, and obsessional compulsive behaviours, which are all designed in a way to help regulate the anxiety. It's the mind's way, if you like, of regulating the anxiety. So if anxiety levels are high, the need for the mind is to find something safe, create an experience and a climate of safety. So, for example, with OCD, if it's compulsive checking that plug sockets are switched off, checking doors are locked, windows are locked, when that checking takes place, it starts to alleviate the anxiety once that checking has been completed. But we see how that impinges on life. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy to be doing that day in and day out. So we would think with those more serious levels of anxiety that professional help would be indicated for those children and young people struggling with that level of anxiety. But as I said earlier, we all need a bit of anxiety, really. It sort of motivates us, it gets us up in the morning, and helps us to be creative, to be productive. And without it, we would struggle in a slightly different way. So if we move on to what the causes of anxiety are, in particular in children and young people, it can be a very difficult aspect to pinpoint exactly, because human beings, children and young people, vary. We're all unique, and so we have unique ways of experiencing feelings, especially anxiety, and in terms of expressing and what we do to manage our anxiety. So, but generally speaking, we're going to look at some of the key aspects or key causes of anxiety in children and young people. And what we found through research is that often anxiety can be prevalent within families. So close family relatives, parents, grandparents who have struggled themselves with anxiety can often be sort of almost passed on in a way. There's an increased likelihood of children becoming anxious themselves, but it's not an inevitable correlation. I think with modern day research and child development research, the cause of anxiety can often be linked with early degrees of trauma or challenging life events for children very early on in their lives, and perhaps a consistent level of transitions or changes in a child's or young person's life early on can impact on their or increase their levels of anxiety going forwards. I think how anxiety is managed, in particular by parents, and how emotions can be managed generally in families, can either have a kind of protective factor for children going forward in how they manage their anxiety, or increase the likelihood that anxiety will be an issue in their emotional lives. But generally speaking, we would look at a number of aspects that can increase the likelihood of children being anxious. So, for example, if there are lots of change or uncertainty in early on in a child's life, that can increase the likelihood of anxiety. Conflict within family, separations, divorce can, as we know, can impact, and it's often how parents manage those very difficult times that can help children manage their worries and anxieties about that. Bereavement can be another cause, and distressing traumatic events in life generally can have an impact on a child's emotional states and thereby anxiety levels. We know about bullying at schools, that can have a huge impact on a child's confidence and with it their anxiety levels. And generally speaking, those transitions, the key transitions from sort of nursery to from being at home with parents to nursery, from nursery to junior school, all those transitions through school and through life are the kind of key areas where anxiety can increase. I think generally speaking, as human beings, we all like to have some certainty and predictability in our lives, and we start to feel anxious and unsettled when that degree of certainty and predictability gets shaken, when something new comes in or something changes our aspects of our lives. That's when anxiety can increase. So what's useful to think about is, how does anxiety manifest itself in children and young people? What are the telltale signs of a child or teenager who is anxious? And again, it's a complex picture because children inevitably and young people will inevitably manage and manifest their anxiety in different ways. And generally speaking, anxiety In younger children, for example, there's often a sort of what we call a somatic element to that, especially in younger children where there's a bodily ailment, an ache or a pain. For example, we all know about the child, or even as adults, when we are anxious, there can be an upset tummy or a tummy ache or a headache. So those are the sort of often telltale signs of a younger child who is anxious. Of course, sleep and appetite are also aspects that can be affected by anxiety. And what we do as psychotherapists and mental health professionals working with children, we often look at the level of functioning of an individual child or young person. So, for example, for a young child, we'd say their kind of appropriate level of functioning would include being able to play, being able to explore, be curious about their world. So if there's an increased level of anxiety about something, then those seems to be the areas that get affected. So a child who is very, very anxious will stop playing, for example. And again, with sleep disturbance, perhaps loss of appetite, maybe some night terrors, so on and so forth coming in. So those would be useful signs and signals for parents to look out for in their children. With teenagers, we might think, and older children, we might think the level of functioning is about how they're able to get on with their schoolwork. Are they engaging in lessons at school and subjects and so on? Are they socializing and mixing well? Are they engaged in family activities? And if, for example, anxiety levels have increased, often those areas get impinged upon. So there's a withdrawal, they get behind with their schoolwork, or they're putting it off, they're avoiding it. And in more extreme cases, the school refusal. And if we think about that, often the sort of trajectories, the developmental trajectories to go backwards. So where there's high levels of anxiety, development doesn't just get arrested, it can go back. So there's more separation anxiety, there's more clinginess, there's a wish to stay at home. So it's almost like the child's emotional development is going backwards to some degree. And that can be as a result of high levels of anxiety. There's lots of other ways that we can spot potential higher levels of increasing levels of anxiety are in a child's behavior. So, for example, some children become more aggressive, more oppositional. Parents start to have more problems in a child following rules and boundaries at home. And often that can be as a sort of a kind of antidote to feeling out of control. So I'm going to gain some control. I think as human beings, again, we do prefer to know and to have some certainty and perhaps therefore an element of control over our environment. But for a child who is experiencing increased levels of anxiety and feeling out of control, their emotions are out of control, they may then resort to more behavioural ways of gaining some control. And that can be very challenging for parents. So with older children, with teenagers, perhaps approaching the end of their school life, we'd have to think about how anxious a time that can be. A huge transition is about to occur, whereby everything that they've been familiar with for many years, the school life, the school routine, being at home with family, and so on and so forth, that is coming to an end, and a great deal of uncertainty is about to happen in terms of where they're going with their lives next. And so we see with that anxiety, often young people can become more childlike almost. And as much as they present with this strong, independent sort of front, there's underneath is this sort of fragile and brittleness around this time, whereby some children actually struggle educationally, and almost like they're sabotaging their sort of final exams or their run up to A levels or so on. So that can be a very challenging time, which I think as parents, as professionals, we really need to keep in mind just how hard and challenging a time that can be for young people.
Harley Therapy, the UK's leading experts in therapy and mental health care, right here in London or online.
I think we may have read in the news very, very recently that that there's been a significant increase in the amount of young people experiencing anxiety, and the figures are actually quite startling. So the Commissioner for Children in England and the NHS just in August gave some statistics about children and anxiety, and strikingly, the figures were 500 children and young people a day being referred to mental health services as a result of anxiety, and over 200,000 between 2023 and August 2024, over 200,000 children and young people under the age of 17 being referred just solely as a result of anxiety. So what is this increase about? Well, we are aware that, and we'll come back to this a bit later, but out of a lot of feelings, I think anxiety can be the one that we might think of as being the most contagious. So if we think of how in a group of people, it takes one or two people to suddenly become anxious, and we see how that can spread through a group. So that's an interesting thought as to possibly if there's more anxiety around, then perhaps there's more people, young people, children, struggling with the experience of anxiety. I think personally we'd have to look back at COVID too, and the impact that had on well, everybody, but children and young people in particular. And if we're thinking about how important the routine and structure is for children, we think about the impact that COVID and the lockdowns had on, and the disruption that had on children's lives in terms of their school routine, their structure, and so on and so forth. And also we'd have to think that the news reports of the daily amount of people succumbing to COVID increased, I think, the nation's anxiety levels in many respects. The threat was real. People were losing their lives. People were seriously affected by it. So we'd have to think that the COVID pandemic did have a significant impact on children. I've come across children and young people though who said actually COVID was and the lockdowns were a useful time, but interestingly they were children who struggled with a lot of anxiety, and so being at home in the safe cocoon of an environment in a way helped to manage their anxiety. So we have a complex picture. But I think we also would look at, and there's been a lot of research into sort of social media and the impact of that on anxiety in children. Now, social media has some very positive aspects that children find enhances their lives, but at the same time, it can create anxiety, especially if there is a sort of a child who has more propensity to anxiety, becomes very self-conscious, for example. And so it's a complex aspect, but we would look at some of the aspects of social media that can put a lot of pressure on children and young people. And thinking about pressure, we'd also have to think about the educational pressure today on children and in particular teenagers. Wanting to do well, not wanting to disappoint, wanting to succeed in life and do well with GCSEs and A levels and IB tests, etc., puts an enormous amount of pressure, and therefore anxiety does build. And then if we look more today and think about the news and reports about war in Ukraine, the Middle East, and also the climate crisis. When I work with young people in particular, those topics often come up as a factor in terms of them being anxious about the future. What's the future going to look like? So we would look at all of these things as potential contributing factors in this increase in anxiety levels through children and teenagehood. So when it comes to this, the key aspect of this presentation, which is how can parents help to support their children with anxiety, I'm going to break this question into two different aspects, if you like. The first is what we would describe as the sort of parent doing, and that is the parent that can be practical, can suggest things, can bring things in for the child that would really help them to alleviate some of these high levels of anxiety. So, for example, validating a child's feelings, letting them know that you can see they're anxious, can be really helpful for that child to feel like it's been listened to and their feelings have been taken seriously. And so I think making suggestions, talking through strategies with their child, trying them out together, for example, would be really helpful. So, for example, if we had a situation of a child who is getting public transport to school for the first time, maybe, they're very anxious about that, understandably, then you would have this sort of incremental approach. And it's not rocket science. I think it's what a lot of parents do, but it's a structured approach whereby, well, you would get on the bus with your child and go and take them on this journey, show them which stop they get off, so on and so forth. And then the next incremental step would be, right, well, to meet the child at school. So they get the bus by themselves, and you're there at the school to meet and greet them. And then slowly but surely building up until the child is doing that on their own. So it's almost like a graded exposure to the source of the anxiety, if you like. And that's a very useful strategy for dealing and supporting children with a lot of situations that can create anxiety. We might say that there are there's more modern research about breathing exercises, for example, how breathing in a certain way can increase sort of those kind of more happy hormonal chemicals in the brain, oxytocin and serotonin, which does bring down anxiety levels. So as much as it's a cliche these days, well, take some deep breaths, there's a lot of research that's saying actually, it has a number of very positive impacts and effects on the body. So things like exercise also can help to alleviate or bring anxiety down. I think for some children, possibly the impact of diet, sugar, older children, caffeine, reducing those down can be helpful. Also, mindfulness exercises can be really useful, and you can get sort of directions and advice about how to undertake that, and all of these things are online. I think what we're also talking about, where in particular where children and young people are concerned, but this goes for all of us too, and that is, if we can put our feelings to words, then we know that that can have a transformative effect. So, if I can talk about my worries, if I can talk about my anxiety, if I can get it out, then somehow it doesn't feel as bad, especially if I'm sharing that with somebody. So for children to be able to write things down, to keep a journal, for example, or if the anxiety is very high, to talk to a professional, then we see some very, very quick positive effects on children being able to better manage and understand their anxiety when they're sharing it. I think out of all of the doing things that a parent can instill for their children and in their children is routine and structure. We know children's struggle and anxiety levels really do increase when structure and routine are affected. So I think if where possible to keep the routine for children is really important. So there's that predictability, and in child development research we call it experience expectant, and that means that I know from my experience that I've built up, I know that B follows A and C follows B, and that is reassuring. When all of that changes, which sometimes in life it does, then we expect an increase in anxiety. So I think that would be the parent doing. Now we come on to the parent being, which I think is a more challenging aspect, but a vitally important one. So in this part, we're looking at the parent state of mind. And I think, as we've said earlier, we know that anxiety can be contagious, if you like. It can get passed on. A lot of feelings can. So we know through research that how a family manages its emotional states, how it experiences them, how it expresses them, does get passed on to children more frequently than not. So what we're looking at here is, it's advice for parents in a way, is right, what can we do as parents to help our children with their anxiety through being able to, what we call, contain their own anxious feelings. So we're going to sort of think about that now. And as a psychotherapist working with children and young people, and also parents, we really advocate and promote this idea of containment of emotions. Now, what I mean by that is that we're really focusing and trying to tolerate our own uncertainty and not knowing, and managing our own feelings of anxiety without diving headfirst into action and doing. Now that might contradict that first part of the parent support, which is doing, and there is a place for doing. We're not saying that, but if we can get that balance sometimes of just postponing action, just thinking and staying with our child who is struggling with anxiety, that has huge beneficial effects for our children. So how do we manage our own anxiety? How do we stay with it? Because with anxiety, it does push us. It does push us very powerfully to want to do something. Feeling helpless or powerless is probably one of the, or vulnerable, probably some of the worst feelings as human beings that we have. Well, I'm going to go back to a reference an English poet, John Keats, who in 1817 talked about this idea of negative capability. What he meant by that was, how can we stay with uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without reaching after fact or reason, as he put it. And so how can we, which is very difficult to do, just stay with our uncertainty and doubt? If we can, and if we can stay with it, then generally speaking, it can dissipate. And we're using that in a way to think about how children model their ways of managing their emotions by watching, observing, unconsciously often, how their parents are managing their feelings, especially anxiety. So in a sense, being able to contain our emotions will have a very positive legacy, if you like, on our children and potentially their children. So we are changing a way of being with our feelings, if you like, especially those more difficult feelings like anger, fear, anxiety. So if we can just hold on to those before we act, to think with our child, to validate those feelings of the child, to be able to sit down and, especially with the older children, to think with them about how they could manage a situation that's creating some anxiety. That, I think, is a much healthier way of doing it and builds up resilience in children and young people. I like to sort of phrase it as having a foot in the other's, or having one foot in the other's shoe, not both feet. So that in a sense, if I've got one foot in their shoe, I'm with them with their feelings, I'm taking their feelings seriously, but I'm also having one foot in my own shoe, managing my own emotions, my own anxieties as a result of what I'm picking up from them. And I think that can be very powerfully illustrated with teenagers in particular. Teenagers tend to expel their feelings in a very powerful and very strong way, and that does have an impact on parents to the point where then they start to get anxious or they start to get angry, and then they're pulled in to that anxious world of their teenage child. So in a sense, if I can keep a foot out of that, to keep thinking, to keep being curious, to keep wondering what's going on here, how can this be, the situation or state of mind, how can that be lessened and improved, then I think that's a very good process for a child and young person to be learning. I can probably hear a lot of parents go, well, it's a bit late now. I've got a teenage daughter or son, and we've been operating in this way for a good while. And I would say, well, research has really given us a lot of hope that no matter how old we are, we can develop new ways of managing and expressing our feelings. And neuroscience has been very helpful in that, in a way that we can develop new neural pathways, which means we can control our feelings better. We can deal with our anxiety better. And again, this has it takes time. It takes time to do that, but it's not impossible to do it. So it's never too late to change how we experience our anxiety and how we express it. And I think that has a real legacy for not only our children, but for their children as well.
Subscribe for more insights from the experts at Harley Therapy, and don't miss our next video.